Hey everybody, my name is Kenton Jones. I have been requested by your lovely instructor, Michelle, to talk to you for a few minutes about how to approach designing scenery for a play. All right, so I've put together a PowerPoint here and I'm going to narrate it in one take. That's how confident I am about this. Hope you enjoy it and hope you get some benefit from it. Let's begin. How do you approach the scene design process? I won't bore you by reading this out loud, but this pretty much sums up the approach to scenic design. Before we start talking about how I approach a process, let's take a look at the goals of scenic design, all right? So clearly, when you're designing scenery for a play, the fundamental things you want to do are establish a sense of place. Where are we? Where are these characters? And what kind of mood do you want to create for the audience? For instance, if you're producing Dracula, it's a pretty scary play, all right? So you want a lot of mood and atmosphere. I think this photograph here pretty clearly shows the audience where they are and how they should be feeling. Your job also is to support the story. All right, the playwright has gone to a lot of trouble to write this story, and it's your job to make sure that playwright's story gets told. So that's what we're focusing on today. You also want to make sure you're allowing plenty of room and space for movement, for action in the play. How are you reinforcing the play's theme? And, Michelle, maybe most importantly, how are you working with the director to support their concept of the play? Some practical concerns as well. You want to make sure performers are going to be safe during the show. Clearly, you want to make sure everyone in the audience has a good view for the play. I like this one, create a believable environment. Even though this design by David Hockney, who is an important contemporary artist, is really kind of Dr. Seussish looking, right? It's still a believable environment. An audience is going to suspend their disbelief. I'm sure you've talked about that in class. All right, so they'll accept whatever you're putting in front of them. And are you creating a clear focus that will help the director focus the audience's attention on the play? Pretty obvious stuff, right? So let's get down to the real nitty-gritty, the storytelling, which is the most important part of design. How do you help support the story? So I'm going to talk you through and show you some pictures of a production I did several years ago. It was a dramatized version of Bud, Not Buddy. I'm sure a lot of you are well familiar with the story. Okay? So off to the side, I'm showing you some fan art, some children's illustrations of the book. It's a really, really beloved book. So we didn't want to create something that was going to be too specific. We wanted the children's audience to be able to kind of fill in the blanks and not interfere too much with the world they were already envisioning from the book. Hope that makes sense. here we go. Let's see how we approached that. Here's our director, lovely Mariah Sage. She was working on her MFA. I was working on my MFA. And I really wanted to help her tell this story. Mariah's main interest was storytelling. She didn't want anything on stage that did not move the story forward or help the actors tell the story. Come to find out, I do a lot of research when I approach a play. Bud Not Buddy takes place during the Great Depression, in the time of Herbert Hoover's presidency. You try saying that 3 times fast. So in researching the area, which was around Detroit and Ann Arbor, Michigan, Flint, Michigan, to be exact, which is where we were going to school. As Bud travels to find his family, he stays for a while in a temporary housing situation, let's say, that looks like these research photographs. These were called Hoovervilles because they were named after the president. A lot of people and families were displaced during the Great Depression, but they had to live somewhere, right? And I was really, really impressed, we'll go back a slide, to how people were able to use available materials and create a sense of shelter and home. I also think they're really beautiful structures in their poverty. So this was the look I brought to the director and said, how about we create something on stage that shows the transience of all of these people and gives a sense of Bud's journey as he travels looking for his father. This is what I came up with eventually. The other idea I had was that since we were in the same geographic area that the story takes place in, I've always wanted to do this. So here was my chance. I reached out to people in the area. I scoured the area around Flint, Michigan, Ann Arbor, Detroit, looking for authentically used building materials. We also didn't have a lot of money to spend. So I reached out through Facebook Marketplace, through Craigslist, posted ads online, and got a lot of people to donate used wood, pallets, all sorts of things. All right, so in this way, we were gathering things from the community and allowing people in the community to contribute to this play. That was an important concept to me, and for Mariah, the director, it also echoed the main theme of the story, which is about finding and creating community. Let me draw your attention to, is my mouse working? All the way over here. My favorite thing that got donated was the side of a refrigerator crate that was actually from 1930 that somebody had in their backyard, and they said, oh, take it, I don't need it. So here's an example of how all of this found wood was put to use to create something that echoed the look of the shanty towns, the Hoovervilles, but still provided a safe, workable space for the actors and the storytelling. This was an important feature in the book that I really related to. Bud, at one point, is locked in a shed, and the shed has these pike heads mounted to it. This was more important to me than to the director, but she was very kind in letting me create this piece because I grew up partly on a farm, and my grandfather had a shed that had dried pike heads mounted to it. So this is a real thing that people did back then. It's a superstitious thing that, mounting pike heads on a door chases away the evil spirits. So anyway, we kept it in the play, and I just love the look of it so much. So sometimes a director just says, oh, okay, I don't need it, but we'll make use of it. Is that right, Michelle? Couple of more action shots showing how the performers interacted with the environment. They could move the crates around and the tarps and create different environments within this stage setting. And over here, prop-wise, it was important for Bud to have a suitcase that looked a lot like the illustrations from the book. Now, just because a play has been designed and even built, it's not done. It's still an organic process. So while I was watching rehearsal one night, in the library scene, I noticed one of the actors, this guy, looking at a wall, pretending he's looking at books. And that kind of bothered me. So I checked and made sure it was okay with the director if I added a little hidden panel that actually had books in it. And she loved the idea, so that's where that idea came from. All right, we're going to talk about one more play that has some more technical design aspects to it, okay? The play is Intimate Apparel. It's another play that takes place around the same time, 1920, 1930, I think. It's a story about a young African-American woman who has escaped slavery from the South, made her way to New York City, and has become a very successful seamstress. She creates intimate apparel, underwear for rich women. So she's made quite a name for herself, but she's still poor. Again, I really enjoyed diving into research. I wanted to get a sense of what this neighborhood might look like, what textures and aged floors would look like. I got really specific with things like doorknobs and mirrors. There's a wealthy patron that dresses and undresses behind a dressing screen. So we created that for the play. And part of Esther's journey, she's the young seamstress, was that she becomes friends with a man who works in a fabric store, but he's also quite poor. So he sells scraps of material from his tiny apartment. So we had to create a believable environment for him as well. This is the ground plan that we eventually came up with. It's really important for a designer, for a director, and for all of the other creative collaborators, did I say that right? That they all have an idea of what the overhead view of the set is going to look like, so that they can plot the travel, the action of all of the characters. This gets a little tricky, because while I'm creating a ground plan to make sure it's going to fit in the space, I also have to keep in mind, there we go. I've added an arrow here to show how Esther is going to travel from her apartment over here to her friend who sells fabric on the top level, stage right. That's what the red arrow is. So how might this look from the front, and we call that a front elevation. This was the first version I came up with, so it's not what the final product looked like. But the director of this piece had a really strong concept as well that I needed to work into the overall plan. He loved the idea of fabric hanging over the stage that would sort of follow Esther's journey, because she is in fact creating a quilt of her own life. I happened to like the idea, so I started playing around with how fabric hanging over stage might support the story of Esther's journey, and also create believable, realistic environments for each of the characters that figure into Esther's story. After the ground plan, after we've seen a possible elevation, I get busy and start creating a model. And it's going to be a rough model because I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I do want to make sure everything I have in mind is represented. So this is a model that comes from the first ground plan. Okay. The director liked it, but it wasn't quite the right layout. We wanted to get more distance between Esther, here in the middle with her sewing machine, and her friend up here that sells her fabric. So we did that by moving Esther all the way over here so that she had a further journey to travel down. Go back here one more time. What we ended up with was something that looked like a street going down here that Esther could travel through. So that actually made sense, that the audience would get to see Esther actually making a long journey to get the supplies she needed. Finally, we get to a revised model. So here we go. This was the finished look of how things played out on stage. There's quite a bit more detail here because, again, we wanted to provide just enough furnishings in each of these areas that it would look, believable. The audience would believe that people actually lived in these little areas. I also added more fabric, as you can tell, going up the sides of the proscenium arch. To me, this helped tie the whole story together. And it's kind of subtle, but hopefully the fabric hanging over each of these areas helped tie the characters underneath them into the overall story of the play. Here are some production photos from how it ended up looking. So the lighting designer is a really important collaborator in the process. It's the lighting designer that ultimately is going to focus the audience's attention on what specific area they need to be looking at. The lighting designer and I, and the director and costume designer, were also all working from the same basic color palette so that our work seemed to be cohesive. And finally, some detail shots. I really am big on detail, if you haven't noticed by now. So I wanted to make sure each of these characters had something that revealed their character a little bit better to the audience. And that's what these photos here show. The picture in the bottom really, again, shows the lighting designer's contribution. You notice we have a chandelier hanging over the stage that's actually lit up. And the dressing screen I talked about earlier is lit from behind so that the audience gets to see the wealthy woman's silhouette as she's changing clothes. There you go. That went as well as I hoped it would. I hope you got something out of that, and please chat amongst yourselves in class. And I would love any feedback anybody cares to give me, because I'm also an instructor and I will be showing this to my students at some point. Thank you for paying attention. Now, how do I turn this off? Stop.